really briefly, when people talk about populism, when you read about populist politics in the media, what those commentators, what those journalists are really talking about, if you're reading a British or an American paper, is they're talking about Brexit, they're talking about Farage, they're talking about Donald Trump, okay? So if you want like a really quick take home, what is populism? All right, populism is basically the politics of Brexit, the politics of Farage, the politics of Donald Trump. That's what populism is. It's not necessarily the things, the policies that they support, but it's the kind of the tone with which they speak and the way they view the world. And that's really at its core what populism is. I think there are a few key events then that we can point to, that we can characterize as this new wave of populism. I've mentioned two of them already: Brexit and the campaign around that, the election of Trump, but also the kind of very near election of Marine Le Pen of the French National Front party, who is a populist very much in the same vein as Farage and Trump, who nearly became the president of France, but very, very narrowly didn't. So it's these events as well that have led to the media saying there is this new kind of wave of populist politics. All right, so really what I'm going to try and do in this talk is explain three key things. The first thing is roughly what populism is. Like, what is it that makes a populist politician different from some other kind of politician? What is it that makes populist political movements populist? How do we distinguish populist political movements from other political movements? Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is to talk a bit about what it is that populists do when they're in power. So when populists get elected, how is the way that they govern different to the way that other kinds of politicians govern? And that seems to be, well, I think that's a kind of key distinction that we can make between populists and non-populists, is their different approaches to governance when they are in power. Okay, but the third thing that we're going to do as well is look at what populism isn't. And the reason that we're going to do that is because I think most people's idea of what populism is comes from reading the media, comes from reading the papers. It comes from sort of forming an idea of what populism is based on seeing journalists and commentators and news reporters saying so-and-so is a populist, and then sort of constructing in your own mind a bit of a kind of outline of what populism is based on the various things that those commentators have said. And in my view, the things that the kind of the British and American commentators and opinion writers have said about populism are by and large not really correct, or sometimes they have elements of truth to them, but they come nowhere near being a sort of full definition of what populism really is. So this first slide is a collection of things that the journalists and commentators usually say about populist politicians. The case I'm going to make is that each of these things is not really correct. Like, these things are not really what populism is. So the first thing that people say about populists, or the first thing that media commentators often say about populists, is that they support policies that are at the extreme end of the political left or the extreme end of the political right. Basically, that they are extremists of some sort or another. Now, if we look at Trump and we look at Farage, that's certainly true, but it's also true that you get people who are widely regarded as populists across the rest of the world who are not in these kind of extreme political camps. You do get much more moderate populists, okay? So as a definition of what populism is, this doesn't quite do it for us. The second thing is that it's a bit debatable about what really counts as the centre ground, or what counts as the extreme left or the extreme right. That depends very much on the context. It depends on the country that this particular person is operating in. So, for example, if we take someone like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, they are widely regarded or widely spoken about as being populists, which I actually think they're not, but we'll come to that later. But they're widely kind of branded as populists, being like left-wing populists. But actually, the policies that they support are kind of not uncommon and in practice in a lot of Scandinavian countries, for example. So the idea that there is a clearly definable political centre ground is not really tenable. So therefore the idea that populists occupy only spaces outside this centre ground just isn't working as a definition of populism, right? So sort of remove from your mind the idea that populists are always political extremists. Just not true. All right, the second thing that is often said about populists is that they appeal to people who feel angry or, quote, left behind or abandoned by the political establishment, or people who in some way, you know, have not benefited economically or socially from globalization, people for whom economic growth in their country has not really turned into kind of individual personal wealth, right? And this is really an attempt to try and define populism by who votes for populists. So it's a way of trying to define a populist politician by saying, well, you're a populist if a certain demographic of people vote for you. You're a populist if these, quote, left behind people in society find you appealing and then vote for you. Now, it's certainly true that lots of people who might fit that category do vote for populists, but it's also true that huge numbers of people who very much don't fit that category also vote for populists. So if you look at the Brexit vote, you look at the UKIP vote, you look at the vote for Donald Trump, like, yes, it's true that people who you could regard as being, you know, in this category of people who, you know, who haven't enjoyed the benefits of economic growth, who have been left behind in some sense, vote for populists. But like lots of wealthy people, lots of middle class people, like lots of what populists would, you know, even themselves regard as the establishment, vote for populists. So although it might be true that some of those people vote for populists, we can't make that into a definition of populism, right? It's not watertight enough just to say, well, you know, any politician who enjoys the support of these left behind populations is a populist. Okay, doesn't work. All right, the next thing that you hear a lot in the media about populists is that they occupy this kind of post-truth kind of area of politics, right? The idea that they have a relationship to facts or a relationship to evidence and the truth, which is somehow like completely unmoored from reality, right? They have a particular disdain for evidence or a particular disdain for the facts. And I think, you know, if we look at a lot of the populists that are familiar to us, that is certainly true. Michael Gove's classic, you know, the people of this country have had enough of experts, or you know, Donald Trump's press secretary saying that she was in possession of alternative facts, right? So there is clearly something going on there, like with their relationship to facts and the truth, where they do have a particular disdain for it. But I don't think that we can really make that the definition of a populist, because in order to say that we are now in some kind of post-truth, fact-free political era, we would have to be able to say that at some point in the past there was this era of truthful politics, right? That we've left, okay? And I'm just not convinced that we can look back over the previous few decades and say the 2000s were great, like the era of truthful politics. You know, it just isn't true. You know, pretty much any decade in politics, you can pull out something that was like, you know, a kind of massive lie, basically, can't you? So I just don't think it's true that we've entered a new, fundamentally different political era because certain populists seem to have this particular disdain for facts, right? I think that's always been the case. Politicians, I mean, it's like a total cliche, isn't it? Like, politicians have always lied. Politicians have always had a bit of a strange relationship with the truth. And the populists that we're seeing coming to the fore now, they're just not really any different in that sense. All right. So that, although that's true of them, it is not the definition of a populist. Okay. So this is the final thing that the media kind of commentariat say about populists, and this I think actually is an important part of the definition of a populist. But the case I'm going to make is that although this is part of the definition of a populist, it is not all of the definition of a populist. Okay, so what they say is that populist politicians challenge what they see to be as corrupt elites. They challenge what they see to be as a political elite or a political establishment or a group of people who they regard as being entrenched in power and who have gained power in their view without merit, and a group of people who are clinging on to power, again without merit, but also who are a kind of closed network, a kind of friendship group, a group of people with kind of shared backgrounds and shared interests who have maneuvered themselves into a position of power. And that populists are people who kind of challenge that elite, challenge that establishment. So the case I'm making is that is true, right? To be, if you're not doing that, you're not a populist, basically. Unless you've got an idea of a corrupt elite that you are challenging, you are not really a populist politician. But the first point is that is not all there is to populism, okay? And the second point is that it is not only populist politicians that do this, right? Because pretty much anyone who's standing for election has got to say, oh, well, those guys who are in charge at the moment, they really shouldn't be there, and you should vote for me instead. Okay, so this is like the first point of what makes a populist, but it's not all of what makes a populist. So let's carry on. This I feel is basically like what populism is, right? Populism rests on distinguishing the people from a corrupt elite. So it's not enough just to say there is this corrupt establishment running things. You've got to distinguish that corrupt elite from what you as a populist regard as, quote, the people. And it's this definition of the people and how populists go about marking out who the people really are. Like the populists have different ideas of who counts as the real people or the true people. And this is really kind of the crux of what populism is. It's a kind of political ideology that carves out an idea of the true people, the real people, the deserving people, and sets them up against the corrupt elite. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is basically expand on how populists construct those two groups of people, how they construct their elite that they're challenging, and how they present to the world their idea of who the real people are. And that's, really what I'm saying makes a populist. And that's what makes populists different from other politicians. Other politicians tend not to see the world quite in this way. What I'm going to show you now is just a few examples of populists criticising elites, so you can kind of get the hang of this, with some quotes, right? So here's Farage, and here's the quote: "Remember, anything is possible if enough decent people are prepared to stand up to the establishment." So this is just classic populist stuff, right? He's saying there's an establishment that needs to be stood up to, and it's the people who need to stand up to that establishment. This is Beppe Grillo. He's the leader of Italy's Five Star Movement, which is a kind of populist political party and social movement. Here's his quote: "What is happening today in Italy has never happened before in the history of modern democracies. A democratic revolution which uproots the powers which overturns the pyramids." All right, so this is like, it really gives you an insight into what he thinks Italian establishment politics is. He sees it as like this immovable object, like a pyramid, and he sees his own political party, his own political movement as being the group that is going to take this like immovable establishment and overturn it. Here's Hugo Chavez, and "We must confront the privileged elite who have destroyed a large part of the world." All right, so this, I think, partly makes my case that, populists are not necessarily always on the right. And, what you've got there is like kind of example of, it's almost like environmental populism, right? He's saying that there's a corrupt elite, and what that corrupt elite has done is destroy the environment. All right, so there's a few populists criticizing the different people that they regard as the elite. All right, so the next thing that is really key to populism is the populist idea of who counts as the people. So populists are forever talking about who the people are. It's often quite subtle, but almost everything they say, like any populist speech that you read, or see them speaking to the media, you see them speaking on TV, there is always something in their speech that is telling you or telling the audience who they think counts as the people. And the key thing with most populists is who counts as the people is never all of the people, right? That's like kind of populism 101, right? If you're gonna be a populist, you need to carve out a group of people within your country's population who you regard as the true people or the real people or the deserving people, or however it is you want to frame it. But in some way, a group of people who are different and distinct and deserving versus a group of people who are not, right? So here's some populists marking out their group of the real people, right? So this is Farage talking about Brexit. He says of it, a victory for real people, all right? Now, like, I don't think this is like a kind of flippant thing or a slip of the tongue. Like, what he's saying there is that if you agree with him, if you voted for Brexit, then you are part of the real people, right? If you don't agree with him, then you are in some way not really part of the real people, right? You're something else. There's the real people who voted for Brexit, and then there's everybody else, and they are in some way not real, or like not quite deserving, or not quite people, or I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what he thinks of this other group who didn't vote for Brexit, but one way or another, the real people are the people who agree with him, right? So here's Trump. The only important thing is the unification of the people, because the other people don't mean anything. All right, now I know it's easy. I know it's kind of easy to laugh because it's like such a Trumpish way of saying something, and it's such a clumsy sentence. But what he means there, right? When he talks about the unification of the people, he doesn't mean all American people, right? What he means is that what he's saying is the important thing is the unification of the people who are kind of who support him anyway, right? The unification of all the people who kind of basically already agree with Donald Trump, and them coming together as a group. That's what he's saying, and he's saying that's what's important. And the other people who don't want to unify around Donald Trump or around the Tea Party more broadly, or the other people who don't want to unify around his political ideas, right? They don't mean anything, right? It's not that he's saying they're idiots or they're undeserving or that, some insult. It's just that they don't figure, right? They're not worth thinking about. They just don't mean anything. And this I think is the core of what makes populists populists. Like, non-populist politicians will usually acknowledge that people that disagree with them are nonetheless still kind of at least deserving of the vote, or like they're a part of society. They're a real part of society. They're real human beings. They're people. They have opinions. Like, their citizenship is legitimate. They are part of the populace, right? Whereas populists like Trump and Farage are really trying to mark out, like trying to demarcate a group of people who are the real deserving people and a group of people who just don't matter or aren't even real in some sense. Okay. This is a really interesting one from Finland. Okay, so in Finland, the populist. This is such a like Farage kind of rip-off, isn't it? Right? Like, I don't know who's copying who. Anyway, in Finland, the main populist political party used to be called the True Finns. All right, when it was founded, it was called the True Finns. So you can see what they're doing there, right? They're saying that some people in Finland are the true Finns, right? People they're quite a racist nationalist party. So in their view, the true Finns are kind of white Finnish people, basically, white Finnish people who agree with their nationalist politics. They would be the true Finns, right? And everyone else is what, like, not a true Finn, an untrue Finn, like somehow in their view not really Finnish, like not really a citizen, not really part of Finnish society. Like, that's what they're getting at by calling their party the True Finns. But then a few years ago, they changed their name simply to the Finns. So in a way, what they're saying there is we don't even need to say that our in-group are the True Finns, right? You're a Finn because we say you're a Finn, because you fit our kind of ethnic, nationalistic view of what a Finnish person is, or you're just, or you're just not really part of Finnish society. This is the, you know, the kind of absolute like archetypal populist construction of who counts as the people, right? You've got the people that you like, that you want, that you think are deserving and legitimate, and then there's other people who just don't really figure, don't matter. They're not really Finns, or they're not really true Finns, or they're not real people. So what we can do now is go through a few examples of populist political movements and political parties, and just look at how they have constructed their true people and their elites, right? So here's the first one, the Tea Party. Tea Party, I mean, I'm sure you probably know, it's not a political party, it's kind of like a political movement or a political faction of the Republican Party in the United States. But their view of the people is that they're basically working and middle class people, but importantly, they tap into this idea, which has quite a long history in the United States, of producerism, which is that real people, or kind of real jobs, are jobs in producing, in manufacturing, and in farming, right? And that's like quite an important idea in the Tea Party, in their construction of the people. It's working people who make stuff, right? Their archetypal Tea Party citizen is a white Christian person working in manufacturing, working in farming, working to make something, right? And everyone else is just, you know, broadly, they would say, not really part of the people. Okay, their construction of the elite is actually a bit more complicated and quite strange in a lot of ways. It includes some totally expected things, like obviously they regard Washington politicians as being part of a corrupt elite, even though many of, you know, kind of the key people of the Tea Party are also Washington politicians, right? They have a particular disdain for university lecturers and professors, and they see a kind of revolving door between Washington politics and university life, and they see this as how kind of, as they see it, Washington politics has ended up so liberal. There's a particular disdain for banking and finance. There's obviously a particular disdain for the Democrats, but strangely, into what they regard as elites, they have also put minorities, right? Minority groups in America. And you think like, well, that sounds like, you know, how on earth can you logically do that? But you can't, but their sort of conspiracy-ish thinking around it kind of goes like this. And they say, well, you know, the Washington politicians and the Democrats have lost, have lost the heart or lost the soul or no longer appeal to these working and middle class white Christian producers, and that what they're doing is building up the minority vote in order to continue in power, even though they're ignoring the interests of these, you know, real people. So they have this kind of quite wide-ranging, quite complicated view of who counts as the elite. All right, this is one from history, okay? So you thought that the Tea Party had a really narrow view of who counts as the real people. But this is the Populist Party. They were never that successful, but they existed in the US at the end of the 19th century. In their rhetoric, in the kind of the speeches that were recorded or written down of them, you can see their construction of who counts as the people, and it's like really, really narrow, right? It's only farmers, like they're the only kind of legitimate people, but it's not tenant farmers, it's only farmers who own their own land, only farmers of European descent, and also only Protestants, right? So they, like, the point I'm trying to make with this is that populists can make this idea of the legitimate people or the true people as broad or as narrow as they want, depending on what their political purposes are. So the Populist Party, you know, found it useful to carve out this very, very narrow landowning farmers, kind of white landowning Protestant farmers, and set them up in opposition again to something that was actually much more narrow than modern populists make out as their elite, right? They didn't really mind that much about the rest of the Washington establishment, the rest of American politics. Really, the people that they regarded as the corrupt elite were just Washington moneylenders, people who they saw as having given unfavourable loans to the farmers and were kind of therefore part of their kind of ongoing poverty. Quick summary. The key thing about populists is their idea of the elite and their idea of who counts as the people. But one of the really key things that makes populists is how they see their relationship to this group that they regard as the true people, all right? How they view themselves as, for example, a charismatic populist politician, how they see themselves relating to this group that they think of as the people. And the first thing about it is, in general, populists tend to think that they alone represent the people, right? And this is something that you don't really see in other politicians. Like, other politicians, regardless of how much you might dislike them, right, tend not to believe that they are the one true voice of the people. But populists often really do genuinely believe that they are the only person who can actually represent the people, right? So here are a few examples, right? Here's Berlusconi, like, only I can turn this country around, right? And I think it's a little bit out of context, but if you look at the rest of the speech that this comes from, what he's really saying, he's not saying like, I'm uniquely competent, like I'm such a great like politician or negotiator or economist that I'm the only person who can turn this country around. What he's saying is like, I'm really the only person who understands what real Italians want. Like, no one else understands them like I do. So therefore, I'm really the only person who can run Italy for you. That's what he's getting at. He's not talking about his competence as a leader. He's talking about what he believes to be his unique relationship with what he regards as the real Italian citizens. All right. Here's a couple from one of Hugo Chávez's election campaigns that are quite interesting, I think. The translation of them, the top piece of graffiti says, Chavez is the people. The lower poster says, you are also Chavez, right? But what he's getting at here is, he's saying, like, I'm part of the people. This construction, this idea of the people, like, I'm part of it. But you, as the people, are also basically somehow part of Chavez. The idea is to almost kind of like bind the idea of Hugo Chavez and the people together into one thing, and then present that back to the people as in election slogans, So of course, like if Chavez is the people and you are also somehow part of Hugo Chavez, then like who else would you logically have running the country, right? Like if you follow that logic through, you can kind of see that what he's getting at is that because of this connection to the people that he believes he's uniquely able to represent the people. All right, so that's that's typical populist stuff, and I think that kind of thing is what marks out populists from other politicians. You just don't really see other politicians kind of suggesting that they have this like incredible unique connection to the people. Populists tend to think that they know what the people want through instinct alone, okay? They don't really even need to ask the people what it is that they want. They just know it. And I know that to us that might sound completely ridiculous, right? The idea that you might just, kind of be governing, or that you might be somehow in charge or responsible for something, and you might just be like, well, I'm just going to, like every decision that comes, I'm just going to go with my gut instinct, right? And not only will that be what I want, but somehow it'll also be the best thing to do, and will also be what everyone else wants. But populists, I think, really genuinely do believe that, right? Here's a few examples of it. This is Viktor Orbán. He was the president of Hungary. In the run-up to one of the Hungarian elections, he refused to take part in any of the televised debates. He just said, I'm not doing it. And in the statement that he gave to the media about why he wasn't going to do these debates, why he wasn't going to kind of go up and debate his rivals, this is what he said. No policy-specific debates are needed. I'm sure you've seen what happens when a tree falls across a road and people gather around it. Here you have two kinds of people. Those who have many great ideas about how to remove the tree and share their wonderful theories and ideas with others and give them lots of advice. Others simply realise that the best thing to do is to start pulling the tree from the road. We have to understand that for the rebuilding of our economy, it is not theories that are needed, but 30 robust young lads who start working to implement what we all know needs to be done. All right? And I think, like, I know it's a bit of a long quote, but I think, like, that is, in a way, that is such sort of archetypal, typical populist rhetoric, you know, that line, what we all know needs to be done. What he's saying there is, like, there's no discussion needed, like, there's no debate needed. He's saying my ideas about how to reform Hungary's economy won't be improved by any kind of discussion or interaction with anyone else. It's just like pulling a tree out of the road. You've just got to, you just do it. In their kind of warped populist logic, it sort of starts to make sense, right? If he really thinks that, like, him and the real Hungarian people are sort of one of the same, right? Their political instincts are his political instincts. What they want is what he wants. Then, you know, debate, discussion is just a bit of a waste of time. Like, if you know what to do because you just instinctively know what the people want, then, you know, why take part in the debate? Why do anything other than just make the decision? All right, here's Gove. All right, so this is a really famous Gove quote. Couple of weeks before Brexit, and after being challenged on, you know, the fact that however many economists it was had produced this report that said Brexit was going to kind of really damage the economy, he said, people in this country have had enough of experts. Now, I'm not totally convinced that Gove at his core is a populist, but I think that during the referendum, he was part of a populist movement, right? The campaign to leave the EU was, you know, kind of in many ways a populist campaign, and he became one of the figureheads of that campaign, and to some extent he therefore adopted a lot of populist rhetoric, even if it wasn't necessarily what he kind of truly believed in his heart. Nonetheless, during the Brexit campaign, Gove was using a lot of populist rhetoric, and this was a kind of real example of it. But in the warped populist logic, it kind of makes sense. So for people like Gove, leaving the EU was not a practical policy decision, it was a moral decision, right? In his mind, right, there's a huge chunk of the population, you know, the real people, as Nigel Farage called them, who also support Brexit. And Gove probably felt like he understood their instincts. And if he understood their moral instincts, and they were also his, why does it matter if a load of economists think that this is the wrong decision? So that's why he's saying, like, this country's had enough of experts. What he's getting at is, like, this is, you know, I know what the people want, and the people are making what they think is a moral or ethical decision here. It's not one that expert views really matter in at all. So that's why populists say things like that often just seem completely absurd to everyone else. And this is why this idea of populism occupying this post-truth space in politics, this is where that idea comes from. Like I said, I don't think that they're particularly more, you know, full of untruth or full of lies than other politicians. But because they feel that they have this instinctive view of what the people want, they do feel that there is no need for opinion polls. There's no need to ask people. There's no need to consult people about what they want. There's no need to gather evidence or ask experts, because these are just moral decisions that you know are right, and you know that everyone else agrees with you. So that's another kind of key facet of how populists see their relationship to the people. The next thing is that populists tend to think that all of the people have a homogeneous view. They tend to think that everyone has one clear opinion about what ought to be done. And I think this is kind of different from a lot of other politicians who tend to see an amount of diverse, like, diversity within the population about what ought to happen. They tend, even if they dislike a lot of what the electorate think about what to happen, they nonetheless at least accept that there is that diversity of opinion within the population. Populists, on the other hand, really imagine that the people, or the real people, have this one clear, homogeneous view. All right. So here's a few populists demonstrating that. This is Recep Erdogan. He's the Prime Minister and was the President. I can't quite remember. He's been Prime Minister and President of Turkey, hasn't he? Here's his quote. "My nation wants the death penalty. That is the decision of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey." All right. So there are a few things going on here, right? Firstly, he's saying, when he says "my nation wants a death penalty," what he's really getting at is not that the majority of people want the death penalty. What he's saying is that, there's a homogeneous view in Turkey and everyone wants the death penalty. But because he's a populist, right, and he's marking out who counts as the people or who counts as the real people, he's saying, well, if you don't want the death penalty, if you don't want the death penalty as a policy in Turkey, then on some level you're not really part of the populace. You're not really part of the legitimate people, and that therefore then that's the decision of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. So he's saying, like, because the people all have this opinion, there's no real need for any further consultation, and therefore the National Assembly can just take this view because the people have a homogeneous will. It's clear what they want, because he regards himself as having this kind of connection to the people. Like, his instincts are their instincts. They all want the same thing. It can just happen, right? So that's kind of a classic piece of populist policy making. All right. This is the leader of the True Finns, right? This lot again. Whenever I hear the word parliamentarianism, I reach for my gun. All right, now I know, like obviously it is a really extreme opinion, and what he's getting at there is though that because of how he sees himself, because of how he sees his relationship to the people, that the idea of parliamentary discussion, of voting, of debate is just a waste of time. So, like, yes, it's an authoritarian stance to take, right? But what's underneath that authoritarianism is not just the sense that, like, that he ought to be in power because he's brilliant or amazing, or he's kind of going to be an amazing ruler. It's, I suspect, or I think, a sense that all of that voting and debating is just totally unnecessary, right? Because from his perspective, he just looks at the True Finns and he's like, well, I know what they want, right? I know their desires because my gut reaction is their gut reaction. So parliamentary debate, voting, it's just a total waste of time, in his view. This is the final thing. This isn't really a thing that populist politicians think or feel, but it's the idea that populism is ideologically thin. And what that means is that populism itself is not a fully fledged political ideology. But what it's really getting at is the idea that populism is about imagining a corrupt elite and about imagining a group who are the real people. And you can then add all kinds of other ideologies onto that. You can be a populist socialist, or a populist communist, or a populist authoritarian, or a populist nationalist. This way of looking at the world, this way of looking at people, this way of looking at elites can go, or is compatible with, lots of other ideological positions. Okay, and that's what's meant when they say that populism is ideologically thin. It's compatible. It's an incomplete ideology by itself, right? And it's compatible with lots of other ideological positions. This bit is kind of like a bit of an exercise in using this analysis to look at some cases that get get discussed, you know, kind of like you could call them marginal cases, like where there's a debate about whether someone's a populist or not, right? So most of the populists I've shown you so far are just like widely regarded by pretty much everyone as being populist. Like no one doubts that the true Finns are a populist party. But there's been a lot of discussion about whether Jeremy Corbyn is a populist, whether Bernie Sanders is a populist, like the status of political movements like Syriza and Podemos in Spain and Greece, like whether they are populist movements or not. And I think what we can do now is sort of use this analysis of what populism is to try and answer those questions, right? So look, what we've got here is basically a sort of populist checklist, right? Number one, do they criticize elites? Do they have this view of the people? Do they construct a view of the people or the true people? Do they believe that they alone speak for those people? Do they think they know the popular will through instinct? And do they think that the opinion of the people is somehow completely homogenous? So, like, let's have our first example. All right, this is Evo Morales. He was the president of Bolivia. In the academic literature, there's a lot of debate about whether he's really a populist politician or not. And I think, you know, I think he probably isn't. That's my view. I don't think Evo Morales is a populist. So he definitely is highly critical of elites, you know, the United States, the IMF, like people that he sees as kind of having this sort of negative influence on Bolivia. But he doesn't really, in nothing that I've read about him, and really, he never really carves out an idea of a true Bolivian or a real Bolivian or a group of people in Bolivia who are somehow more deserving or like more real than the rest of the population. So his view of who counts as the real people, if he has one, is completely pluralist, right? It's not exclusive in any way. You know, unlike those other populists, he doesn't say, well, you know, it's only people who agree with me or only people who are kind of, you know, of a certain ethnicity or a certain political opinion or anything like that, right? So I think like that puts him, you know, possibly outside being a populist. However, he does have like these other political traits, and if you read a lot of the academic literature about him, the analysis seems to be, but he does view himself as being able to uniquely speak for the Bolivian people in a way that he sort of regards other people as not able to, and also seems in a way to believe that he knows what to do and what to think through some kind of political instinct. Okay, so I would say probably not a populist at the end of the day, but nonetheless kind of has a number of populist traits. And that's really the point here, I think, right? That populism is probably something that in an extent can be in degrees, right? You can be more or less of a populist rather than being like a kind of hard and fast dividing line. Okay, Alexis Tsipras, leader of Syriza, Prime Minister of Greece. Again, he fits this mold, which I think is much more like the Latin American populists, okay? So, obviously, the whole, you know, almost like the purpose of Syriza as a political movement was to create this, well, not create, I mean, it really was there, but was to promote this idea of the troika, you know, like the institutions that had screwed over the Greek economy. These kind of three financial institutions that Syriza really was saying were kind of responsible for the financial situation that Greece was in. And that was their corrupt elite. That was who they marked out as being being these establishment forces. You know, so these established powers that were working against the interests of Greece, right? Syriza also, and I'm not sure this is so true of Tsipras himself, but like if you look at a lot of, you know, kind of other leaders from the movement, there was a sense that the way they spoke, they really did project the idea that they were the only people who could stand up to the Troika on behalf of the Greek people, and that their way of dealing with the European Central Bank and the other European powers was the only way of doing it. Now, in fairness to them, that might have been true, right? So, in some senses, I think what I'm getting at here is there may be populists whose situation isn't a total fabrication, right? I think it's probably the case that Syriza as a political movement really was the only party that was actually going to stand up to the Troika, probably was the only group in Greece that was actually going to negotiate the way they did with those establishment powers. So again, I think, has some of the hallmarks of populism, but also has this totally pluralist idea of who is Greek, who is a Greek citizen. They in no sense really had an exclusive demarcation or a group of people that they said weren't really Greek or weren't really citizens or weren't really part of the people. Here we are, Jeremy Corbyn. I think in the UK media there was really a sort of narrative that had an exact mirror in the United States as well, that went sort of Brexit and Farage is right-wing populism, and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is left-wing populism, and they're sort of somehow two sides of the same coin, or mirror images, or whatever metaphor you want to pick, but that there's somehow something the same about them, and the only thing that's different is one is left-wing and one is right-wing. And you had the same thing in the States, Trump was kind of a right-wing nationalist populist, and Bernie Sanders was a left-wing socialist populist, and that somehow these two things were the same apart from their ideology. Now, I don't really buy that at all. For the simple reason, I think most of this applies to Bernie Sanders as well. I just genuinely don't think that Jeremy Corbyn really bears any of the hallmarks of a populist. He's critical of elites. Sure, he's prepared to say things about banks. He, at no point really in anything he said does he try to mark out a group of people who are true Brits or real Brits or deserving, more deserving Brits. Right, it's totally pluralistic. It extends even to people who aren't British citizens, to migrants and refugees. His view of who is a human, who is deserving, who counts, is so plural that I don't think you can really regard him as a populist. I also don't think that any of these things really apply. I don't think he sees himself as uniquely able to speak for everyone. I think he probably accepts that there's quite a lot of diversity in what British people think about politics. I don't think he regards everyone as having one sort of homogenous opinion, right? So I think by the definition of populism that I've tried to construct over this talk, I don't think Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders are populists at all. All right, a little bit of background here. Populists gain power almost always try to somehow alter or take apart the democratic institutions of the state that they are governing. Populists almost always try to look at the state institutions, the institutions of governance, the democratic checks and balances that most democracies have, and basically try to mess with them. Okay? Now, that actually is something that non-populists try to do as well, right? In fact, it's something that lots of elected people try to do. They get into power and then they try to do things change the constitution or supposedly reform how some bit of the civil service works or make some sort of more permanent change to the democratic apparatus that, they're trying to bake in their politics so that it becomes harder to alter the decisions that they make while they're in power, right? That's fairly common. Lots of politicians try to do that. What's different about populists is they do it really openly. Most non-populist politicians, if they want to do something change the country's constitution, right? Most non-populists will say, oh, well, it was written hundreds of years ago and, it's in need of reform and we need a constitution that reflects the modern times that we live in, and that's why we're changing it. Or if it's some kind of part of the civil service that they feel is kind of always going to be working against them, then they might say, well, this part of the civil service, this bit of the government has become very bloated, it's very inefficient, so we're scrapping it, we're replacing it with something else. But it's always dressed up as something else. It's always dressed up as efficiency or reform or some other kind of legitimate reason why you might do something like that. Populists, on the other hand, they're just happy to do that stuff just straight out in the open. Okay, so here we've got these are things that basically the Fidesz party in Hungary and the Law and Justice PIS party in Poland, both populists who gained power, both did all of these things in their countries, right? So they altered the independence of their courts. They both tore up the constitutions and rewrote them. They both had like purges of bits of the civil service that they felt like were getting in their way, right? Now, those are not uncommon things, bad things, but not uncommon things to happen in democracies. But really, when populists do them, doing them sort of fits with their populist logic. They think, well, these institutions, the High Court judges, this bit of the civil service, they're part of the corrupt elite, right? So why shouldn't we sack them? Like, why shouldn't they be changed? We don't need to do anything other than saying, well, these people are cronies. They're part of this elite that we've always been saying we were going to get rid of. When they get to power, they say you voted for us because we hate the elites and the establishment. This is what you voted for. There's no need for them to dress it up as reform. Within the populist logic, the idea of removing democratic checks and balances, of kind of doing civil service purges, of changing the independence of the courts, it fits neatly within the populist logic, so that they don't have to pretend that it's anything else. They're all getting in the way of the will of the people. The populist knows the will of the people by instinct and can therefore see perhaps that the constitutional court doesn't reflect the will of the people. They stood for elections saying that they would be the people, reflect the will of the people, and get rid of the establishment. So when they sack all the High Court judges, there's no need to say anything other than they're the corrupt elite, and we're replacing them with our people who know the will of know your will through instinct alone, right? So it's it looks, when they do it, it looks just like brazen corruption. It looks like this kind of crazy arrogance that they can just storm in and kind of sack people and kind of just ditch huge bits of the civil service and change the tenure of judges, or rip up the constitution and write a new one. To us, it just looks like these absolute kind of brazen anti-democratic acts. But in their populist logic, it all sort of makes perfect sense and is perfectly justifiable. And when they're challenged on it, they're almost incredulous that other people can't see the logic of what they've done. So the other thing that I think is kind of a hallmark of populists when they're in power is open clientelism, right? So you know what clientelism is? It's like you just give stuff to your political allies, right? Like you just give you give your political allies money, or you give them jobs, or you give them special privileges. You just you're like you find your in-group, and you just give them stuff, basically. And if it's kind of the wider citizenry that you're talking about, then it could be housing, it could be that they get kind of services built near them. If it's kind of more of a political in crowd, it's just typical kind of jobs for the boys stuff, right? Now, lots of politicians do that, but for exactly the same reason, populists feel that they can just do it totally openly. Okay, so I'm going to give you a kind of contrasting example here, right? Here's George Osborne. I think not a populist. I don't think the Cameron government was populist. They basically needed to give a bribe to Middle England during their first term in government when they were in coalition, and they came up with this thing, the married couples tax allowance. And it was basically a way of saying, you know, if you're part of a conventional family, if you're married, if you're living together, then like here's a tax break, right? It was a way of sort of speaking to Middle England to kind of bring people who might have been wavering conservatives back into the fold. It was a way of saying we still think that the traditional family is important, right? But it cost them like hundreds and hundreds of millions, and obviously because like clearly not everyone who's married is a conservative, involved giving that tax break basically to anyone who was married, all right? So as a way of bribing a certain like section of the electorate, it was catastrophically inefficient, right? It involved giving the bribe to lots of people who were never going to vote Conservative anyway. But because they're not populists and because they don't believe in like open corruption, they had to find a way of giving this bribe that on the face of it didn't look totally corrupt, looked like a kind of had the semblance of a policy, even though at its core it was just a way of giving cash to a certain section of society. All right, so that's if you want to bribe a bit of your electorate and you're not a populist, that's how you have to do it, right? But here's Jörg Haider, leader of the Austrian Freedom Party. He would hold rallies and he would just give out cash, right? he would call a rally of, you know, which would obviously only attract people who thought he was great, and he would just hand out €100 notes, which when you think about it is like far more efficient than the married couples tax allowance. If what you want to do is give €100 to the people who you like and the people who like you, far better to say, you know, if you like me, come to the park at 4 p.m. and have, you know, listen to me speak and get €100 than to give, you know, like, you know, spend 600 million bribing a load of people who are going to never vote for you anyway, right? But you know, it's like if you're a populist, you can just do that because you can say, well, these are the real people, the true people, the deserving people. Why shouldn't they have €100 note? Like, what's, you know, in the populist logic, you can practice this totally open clientelism. You can give these bribes very openly. You can say, well, you know, why shouldn't I give that job to someone who's part of our political movement? They know the will of the people. You know, they know it by instinct. They're going to do a great job. Of course they should have that job. Of course they should run the police force. Of course they should be a judge. And then to the wider electorate, of course, you know, these are the deserving people. Of course they should have €100. Like, you can do that stuff. You can do that stuff without challenge. And those things, that open kind of destruction or open altering of state institutions and that open clientelism are the hallmarks of populists when they are in power. And that is pretty much everything.